how foolish can a species be that we think we can mess with massive systems that operate on a global scale that have evolved over hundreds of millions of years to produce life as we know it. Oh yeah, we can change all of that. Come on, people, wake up to the reality that if you change all of that, you're changing the ecological context which has produced us.
All right, I am joined today by Professor William Rees. Thank you so much for being on Urgent Futures.
My pleasure.
I'd love to start at the start and start with your background. I know that your early career was as an ecologist, so I'd love to start there.
Okay. Well, I grew up as a part-time farm boy in southern Ontario in Canada. And I learned at a very early age that we are part of the earth. Even as a child, it fascinated me that by consuming this food, we turned it into our bodies. So that's where I started to think seriously about the relationship between human beings and the earth, the planet that we live on. And it was just part of my mindset through my whole education system and took me all the way to my PhD in population and human ecology. So that's it. That's the background. And I guess there's a really important thing here, and that is having that farming experience, working every day with raising food and recognizing one day that everything on my plate is something that I worked on, that I had a hand in growing, was a tremendous revelation. And it actually, even as a child, made me ask what I today regard as the first question of human ecology. And that is, well, just how much of the Earth's surface, how much land area is needed to support just me in the style to which I am accustomed? And then, of course, if you think about that, you have to ask that about a whole town or a city or a country or the world. How much land base is required to sustain any group of people as they are currently living? And of course, it varies enormously with standard of living, the amount of money we spend on various things. And there's two parts of it. The productive aspect, you need land to produce, but you also need land and ecological processes to assimilate the wastes that are produced. People forget that every act of consumption and production, or production and consumption, involves consuming and dissipating some energy and material, which results in an equivalent amount of waste being dumped out back into the system. And that has to be assimilated somewhere. And those are the kinds of questions that always fascinated me. And it led eventually to my developing with my graduate students the concept of ecological footprint analysis, where we can actually look at what people consume and how much waste they produce every year and convert that into a land area and thereby calculate an answer to my question: how much of the Earth's surface is needed to support me, my family, my city, my country at the current levels of consumption and production?
Mm. And
so that's the background.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And of course, ecological footprint is iconic. And something that I've heard you talk about elsewhere in relationship to this is that carbon dioxide is actually an extreme waste product, but we don't account for it that way.
Yeah, it's an amazing, and people are trying to confuse everybody about that. I mean, carbon dioxide is a normal. I mean, we are a carbon-based lifestyle, and ecologists are very familiar with the so-called carbon cycle. The green plants take up carbon dioxide and water and solar energy and convert all of that with a few nutrients into biomass, the foodstuffs that we eat and convert our own bodies into, and so on and so forth. So there's no question that carbon dioxide is a vital part of life. But the mere act of living, of consuming and burning the food that we eat, releases that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere so plants can take it up again. So in normal nature, there's a circular flow of all of the nutrients that are involved in the production of a living thing. You share many, many molecules that were once roaming Western North America in the bodies of dinosaurs that just keep recycling through the life process. It's an amazing. I still get emotional just thinking about how incredible this whole process is. It's stunning when you start really beginning to understand it and getting into it. Now, we go back a few million years, and there was a lot more carbon in the atmosphere. And the process of life, the accumulation of vast quantities of dead algae and so on and so forth at the bottom of the oceans, covered then with silt, and the enormous pressures of the, the weight of all the water and grime on top of that, converted all of that stuff into something called fossil energy. So that's where our natural gas and our petroleum and eventually coal. Coal is, just basically wood that's been compressed into a form and carbonized, most of the water and all the rest of it removed. So the living processes on the planet removed a vast quantity of carbon from the atmosphere. And by the way, it's interesting that this happened during a period in which the sun was getting increasingly hot. So in a sense, this is part of the Gaia notion that Earth helps to control. The living processes on Earth help to create the environment in which they thrive. So by extracting this carbon from the atmosphere and depositing it underground, the living systems, the ecosystems on Earth, managed to maintain the temperature within a few degrees of what it is today. So the sun increased by 20 or 30% in its output, but the temperature remained relatively constant as the atmospheric carbon dioxide level was drawn down. Now, what human beings have done is reverse that process. We started to extract vast quantities of buried carbon in the form of coal, oil, natural gas, and by burning it, returning it to the atmosphere. And guess what? It means that the atmosphere is now retaining vastly more heat than it used to. And so we're suffering from the consequences of global heating, global warming, climate change, if you like. So we can't extract ourselves in any way, in anything that we do, from the biophysical processes that have created this planet and made it possible for human beings and all other life forms to survive on it. We're beginning to upset that. We're returning us to relatively primitive atmospheres and so on. I don't want to overstate it, but that's basically what's going on.
You're certainly not overstating it, and sort of knowing what I've learned from you. You're definitely like wearing kid gloves at the moment. With the ecological footprint, I think it's helpful for folks to understand the measurements that you're taking to determine, how much biocapacity is being used up by a given city. I've heard you reference the city of Tokyo, but I want to kind of open to you for how you're actually taking this accounting with the ecological footprint.
Well, if you can give me an accurate picture of the average consumption of an individual or of a city. I mean, every year, every city sees vast quantities. We're talking millions of tons of material brought in from the countryside to sustain the activities of the population of that city. You mentioned Tokyo. I mean, I love Tokyo. I've been there many times, talked a lot about this in Tokyo. In fact, one of our first studies was of Japan and Tokyo. But the bottom line is that Tokyo, one city, has the population of Canada. 38 million, almost 40 million people now. That's an astonishing thing. And the fact of the matter is that Tokyo is sustained, supported not by Tokyo. Tokyo, the thing on the map, the little dot that we see as Tokyo, is a tiny fraction, less than 1/3% of the area of the land taken up by Tokyo. So what we have to recognize is that the landscape required and the waterscape required to produce all the foodstuffs and the fiber consumed by Tokyoans, the population of Tokyo, is literally hundreds of times larger than the footprint on the map of the city of Tokyo. And that is all over the world. When you think about globalization, globalization has been a marvel in many respects, but it's also a blindfold because it blinds us to the reality that so many places now don't live on their domestic carrying capacity, or at least productive capacities. They survive because they are able, through their wealth, in a sense, to pillage the productivity of other countries and other places far around the world. So Japan has a footprint several times larger than the country of Japan. Most of Europe has a footprint much larger than the countries that comprise Europe. I think Europe as a whole uses about 3 times as much productive landscape elsewhere on Earth as is contained within Europe. But we don't notice this because we can import stuff from elsewhere. So a country like the Netherlands, you may read from time to time that the Netherlands is a kind of an economic miracle because here's one of the most densely populated countries in Europe, and yet it's food self-sufficient. Well, is it? Food self-sufficiency is a tricky thing because economists measure that often in terms of monetary flows. So it might be the case that if you looked at the monetary cost, the money costs of stuff imported into the Netherlands, and compared that to the cost or the price of things exported from the Netherlands, you might see that the Netherlands has a positive trade balance in even food. But you see, the Netherlands imports vast quantities of fodder to feed its animals' population, which they convert to processed meats and cheeses for export. So you import really cheap shit from somewhere else on the planet and export the most expensive gourmet kinds of tinned meats and cheeses to the rest of the world. And you can come up with a theoretical, at least, economic balance of trade that looks favorable to the Netherlands. By the way, it used to be the case. I'm not sure it is anymore, but that's the way people looked at it. Well, I was once at a conference in Amsterdam in which an economist talked about the miracle. We were speaking, by the way, to a vast number of people from developing countries, and they were looking for models to follow. And this economist was putting the Netherlands up as a model because of the marvelous levels of productivity, resource productivity that Holland was able to achieve. And it proved that you didn't need a lot of land or resources to get rich and acquire all of the wonderful magical gadgets that the people in the Netherlands enjoy. And then he went into this thing about how the Netherlands was even a net importer of foodstuffs. And of course, he was using this monetary measure. This goes back to the 80s, maybe early 90s. And we had just completed the ecological footprint analysis of the Netherlands. And what we showed was that the Netherlands occupies on the planet, just in terms of agricultural area, several times as much land base as contained within the Netherlands. And so on the one hand, reality is defined by how you look at it. So if you're looking at monetary flows, that gives you one picture. If you're looking at material flows, the ecological realities that really count, you get an entirely different picture. So the Netherlands, like Europe as a whole, has an eco footprint quite a bit larger, several times larger than the domestic land base. So the Dutch people, I like to say, well, you don't live in the Netherlands. What do you mean? That's where my home is, right here in Amsterdam. Yeah, but you're surviving because you're living on stuff brought in from all over the planet. So this is how trade, the wonder that it is, and globalization has brought many benefits to many people, nevertheless obscures the fact that we're simply shuffling productive capacity around, which makes it artificially inflate the apparent carrying capacities of a country like the Netherlands. So yeah, you can support tens of millions of people on that tiny land base, but you're not. You're supporting them on stuff brought in from all over the planet. And therefore, the land base you should be looking at is the actual ecological footprint of consumption of that population. And that gives you an entirely different picture than you get if you're looking strictly at the economics.
Mm.
And that is what came to me as not in that full-blown way, but as a farm boy, those were the first questions that came to my mind. What does this really mean? Here I am eating this food, but it's grown on. Well, I know that asparagus took up like 5 square feet of the garden just this morning, and I do that every day. And you can just extrapolate this until you wind up realizing that my lifestyle requires several acres of land just to keep me going as a Canadian or American. We're about the same in that respect.
Mm. As an aside, when you were young and having these realizations, were you talking about that with anyone? Like, were you talking about that with your family or friends? Was this common knowledge? Was this like how was that received at that time?
I didn't, it was kind of just fumbling around in my brain until I really got to university. But I never thought we were relatively poor. My family could not have afforded to send me to college or university. I got a scholarship. Now I was confronted with a problem. What am I going to study? I did really well in high school. That's how I got the scholarship. And I had to make a decision, and I decided life sciences. And again, that's just because my little mind was working back to the the landscape, the ecological realities in which I had grown up as a part-time farm boy. My grandparents' farm. Every summer and Easter and Christmas, we were 8 cousins all working away like mad to keep the thing going. Wonderful experience, denied to 99.9% of young people today, which is a
Mm,
real shame. So no, I didn't think much about it. It was subliminal, I suppose, grinding away until that crucial decision. What should I study in university? And ecology popped into my mind. Well, that's it. Obviously, this is where I'm going. And I took it all the way and eventually even got a job teaching ecology, among other things. So,
mm. You're also known in ecological economics, and I want to take a moment
yes.
because there's a lot of stuff we're going to get into and some terms that people might not be familiar with. So to
Mhm.
start, if you could describe what ecological economics is and how that differs from sort of mainstream contemporary economics.
These are really complicated questions,
I'm
Jeff.
sorry.
No, we have to start by recognizing human beings are kind of weird critters because we don't take reality as it is. We, well, sociologists would say we socially construct our realities. So if you think of academic disciplines or religious, doctrines or economic paradigms or political philosophies, all of these things are products of the human mind. We make it up as we go along. But then we live out of these social constructs as if they represented reality. Okay? That's simply the truth. Look at religion is a made up construct. There are so many different religions, they can't all be like true or accurate, right? So, but people take them so seriously that some go to war over them. They'll blow themselves up over it, or they'll commit atrocious acts against, politicians because they believe that some spiritual whatever told them to do so. So we take our constructs extremely seriously. Uh, and by the way, every scientific theory is a social construct. Economics, mainstream economics, is something called neoliberal economics. It's a made up social construct. And when they made it up, they were actually acting out of physics envy. So physics in the 19th century began to have some very powerful predictive capacities and things that economists had never been able to achieve. So the early neoliberal economists said, you know what? We're going to make of economics the mechanics of utility and self-interest, I think was the phrase used. So they were basing economic theory on Newtonian analytic mechanics because Newtonian laws had such a powerful way of explaining the biophysical world. So economists decided that they could explain human behaviors and so on that way. So that's one set of assumptions. But some other very important assumptions came out of this. First of all, the mainstream economic model doesn't contain the environment. So the fundamental model is something called the circular flows of exchange value. The economy consists, an efficient economy consists merely of businesses and households. And households sell their labor and capital to businesses in exchange for income from shares, dividends, that kind of stuff, and salaries. But then they spend that income back on the firms, the businesses, in order to get goods and services. So you see money circulating, going around in a circle, and material good going in the counterclockwise direction, and that's the whole of the economy. So to make a very strong point here, I think it is a very important point, our fundamental models of the economy see the economy as an independent, separate system that simply self-aggrandizes, grows. The more efficient firms create more money and pay more goods salaries to their employees that have therefore got more money to spend on goods and services. And so this becomes a self-expanding system. In fact, some textbooks from the 80s and so on talk about the economy as being a self-producing entity that is independent of any other artifact. Now, clearly there's a problem here because the old so-called factors of production were land, labor, and knowledge, or capital, shall we say. So it got to the point where the value of something like agricultural produce in that system was so small compared to the value of the financial sector that economists got to the point of almost leaving it out. So instead of looking at the productivity of the economy as a combination of the value of land and labor and capital, they say, what the hell is really, we can leave the land and resource part out. That's not that important because the real weight of the economy comes from capital, from human labor, and now it's knowledge. The knowledge sector is so powerful and important. And so increasingly, the ecosystemic reality of the economy being embedded in something else became sidelined, just left out. Well, what could possibly go wrong? Because what the economists are not really accounting for here is that every single act of production and consumption involves fundamental physical laws, particularly the laws of thermodynamics. You can't produce or consume anything without destroying a much larger portion of something or other. So to produce an automobile involves the consumption and depletion of tons of fossil fuel. It requires the movement of vast tons of material resources to get the steel and all the rest of it. And then we have to refine that, which results in the dissipation of vast quantities of waste products into the atmosphere and so on and so forth. Oh yeah, we got a nice shiny new car, which we value at, some trivial amount, a few $1,000s, but we've left out any accounting for the vast quantities of other materials disposed of in the process. So eventually this economic model bumps up against reality. So keep in mind again, if you have a model that says the economy is a self-producing system, more or less independent of the ecosphere. And by the way, we have another idea in mind that human ingenuity is the real resource, that human technology can substitute for nature. Then combine those two ideas. The economy is a self-producing system, essentially independent from any other major system. And to the extent that it does require resources, that's trivial because the human ingenuity can substitute for resources. So if we run out of, wood, we'll find coal. If we run out of coal, we'll substitute natural gas. And if we run out of natural gas, then petroleum. And if that runs out, hell, now we've got, everybody fascinated by the possibility of an all-electric economy. We're going into solar energy. So one after another, we run through a resource, deplete it, destroy it, pollute the atmosphere, the ground, the waters in the process, but then we invent something to substitute for it. So we've convinced ourselves of our infinite ingenuity and capacity to eliminate nature as an important factor in the equation. So, to make a long story short, mainstream economics does not include any useful information about the nature of the biophysical systems within which the economy is embedded and upon which it feeds, nor, in fact, does it contain a whole lot of useful information about the basic society within which the economy operates. So you have a model that is, by the way, any model is a simplistic rendition of reality. But the neoliberal model is such a simplistic rendition of the biophysical and social realities that it operates within that it can't help but disrupt both. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing the massive pollution of land, water, soil, the acidification of the oceans, climate change. Carbon dioxide emissions are now so great that they, as we talked about earlier, they're changing the whole climate of the planet. How foolish can a species be that we think we can mess with massive systems that operate on a global scale that have evolved over hundreds of millions of years to produce life as we know it? Oh yeah, we can change all of that. Come on, people, wake up to the reality that if you change all of that, you're changing the ecological context which has produced us. You cannot change the ecology in which we have evolved without changing the evolutionary pressures that are acting upon not only us, but the thousands of other species with which we share the planet. And since we're doing that, we're seeing massive increases in species loss. Biodiversity is plunging. We're changing the environment of other species on the planet. We are increasing the scale of the human. You see, the other thing about this model of the economy, there's no limits to growth. If the economy isn't connected to anything important outside of itself, and humans can substitute for nature, then there are no limits to growth. So we've convinced ourselves that the recent 200-year period of growth, that's all there's been on Earth, can continue indefinitely. And as a result, we're rapidly converting. Remember, it's all part of a physical process and the laws of thermodynamics. The growth of the human enterprise is a conversion process whereby we consume the rest of the planet and turn it into our own bodies, and the huge quantities of cultural artifacts, our toys and tools and all the junk that we have. In fact, we're using right now as we talk in this way. But we have to recognize that that is the reality in which we are embedded. And the results are astonishing. If you think about, sorry, if I get too carried away, you can just stop me at any time.
No, I want you to get carried away.
10,000 years ago, human beings, trivial population, less than 1% of the mammalian biomass. Biomass is just a fancy word for the weight. So if you weighed all mammals and took humans aside, less than 1% of the weight of mammals. 10,000 years later, post-agriculture, but in particular, since just 1810, 1820, there were 1 billion people then. There's 8 billion now. So in 200 years, we've expanded enormously. But this is a finite planet, and we are sharing the finite, limited photosynthetic energy converted by green plants from solar energy into food stuff with millions of other species. So this enormous expansion of human beings doesn't come thing like that because of some great factor of human ingenuity. It comes because we are literally displacing other life off the earth. I call it the competitive displacement of non-human life forms. So today, from less than 1% of biomass, humans comprise something like 34%. And by the way, the biomass itself has expanded. 34% of mammals, but our domestic livestock comprise another 62 or something like that. These are, within plus or minus figures. So humans plus our domestic animals are now 96, 97% of all the mammalian biomass on Earth. So wild animals, wild mammals, that is, have been reduced to just 3% of the remaining biomass. And it can't be any other way. If you have a limited flow of biomass created by green plants and humans take more and more, there's less and less available for everybody else. And so biodiversity necessarily collapses as the scale of the human enterprise increases. I often, when I go to political meetings, you'll hear a politician say, there's no conflict between the size and growth of the economy and nature. Well, that's just bullshit ignorance. There's an absolute, direct, diametric conflict between the scale of the human enterprise and the natural system. On a finite planet, one gets bigger, the other gets smaller. And that's the story of the last 200 years. Humans have been getting bigger and bigger, and the rest of nature has been getting smaller and smaller. So ecological economics starts from a different premise. Instead of seeing the economy as a separate system with no really important connectivity to the rest of the ecosphere, ecological economics starts from the assumption that the economy, the whole set of production and consumption activities undertaken by human beings, is a subsystem of the ecospheric system, so that we are an embedded subcomponent of the ecosphere. Like every other species, we're just a consumer and a producer of entropy. Everything we do degrades and dissipates the rest of nature. Well, that's okay as long as nature is recovering at a comparable rate. But nature is not recovering at a comparable rate. So we are creating what physicists would call the entropic disordering of the planet at a much faster rate than it can regenerate. So ecological economics says we have to tune the scale of the human enterprise so that the rate of production and consumption by humans is equivalent to or no greater than the rate of regenerative reconstruction by the natural system. You can't keep catching more fish than the fish stocks can produce each year. You can't keep harvesting more trees than the forests are capable of producing each year. You can't keep eroding and degrading our necessary soils at 40 times faster than they can regenerate but in nature. That's what ecological economics is trying to do. It's literally a reconstruction of our ways of thinking about the economy based more on the biophysical realities that have been revealed by the utter inadequacies of the existing model. So if you think of climate change or global heating, it's a direct consequence of a way of thinking that separates the economy from the rest of the ecosphere and ignores the entropic throughput. The consumption and combustion of fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide as a dissipative byproduct, an entropic byproduct back into the ecosphere. But of course, it accumulates in the atmosphere and heats the planet. Well, that's got to stop. And if it doesn't stop, then we will literally have succeeded, okay, in quotes, in growing ourselves to the point where we're basically a set of maggots in Earth's apple. We're consuming the planet from the inside out, and that will result in the implosion of the human enterprise because there's nothing left to sustain it. So ecological economics, that's really what it's all about. It recognizes the biophysical realities and that human beings, as a subsystem of the ecosphere, has to respect the limits to growth, the limits to production and consumption, that if we're going to have decent lifestyles, we have to limit our populations so that the available productivity is shared in a way that gives us, each of us, a reasonably decent standard of living without destroying the planet. What we're doing right now is saying, look here, we're doing really well in the first world countries, and everybody else should get rich so they can enjoy the same lifestyles that we do. But if the lifestyles of the rich quarter or fifth of people on the planet have already put us into a state of overshoot, which we can define, I will in a moment, then you can't grow the rest of the planet to the same level of production and consumption without destroying the planet. So I've mentioned overshoot. Ecological overshoot is a very simple term. Any population of organisms can overshoot the productive capacity of its habitat. So humans are in a state of overshoot because consumption by human beings, even of so-called renewable and replenishable resources, currently exceeds the rate of production or the rate of rejuvenation, I don't know how you want to put it, of those things in nature. So we are currently consuming faster than nature is producing. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a carbon cycle, there's a nitrogen cycle, there's a cycle of almost everything. We're dumping out so much waste that it's overwhelming those natural cycles. So the carbon cycle is being overwhelmed in two ways. Not only are we dumping too much carbon for the plant material to take up, but we're destroying the plant material. So that many of our forests, I don't know if you've heard, but right now I'm sitting in a province in Canada where there's 400 or 500 forest fires active right now, most of which are out of control. I was nearly trapped by one last week in the interior of this province, by which I mean the roads were getting cut off and I was trying to get back to Vancouver. And 2 years ago, I just stopped for 3 days because forest fires were preventing all the major roads into Vancouver from having traffic. So this is a serious business. Human beings are dissipating planet Earth, meaning consuming, breaking down, throwing it away as pollution in the atmosphere, in the oceans, on the land. And how long can that go on?
And of course, Earth will ultimately generate new systems and new systems dynamics. But the real risk here is for current life on Earth, of which we are part.
Absolutely, yeah. Look, people say, save the planet. You're going to save the planet. And you don't have to. The planet will take care of itself. There's been many mass extinctions in the past for one reason or another. So we're not going to destroy life, but we can certainly destroy the productive basis of anything like a civilization. You know, when things get tough, it may be that social order breaks down absolutely as the remaining millions or billions of humans fight over the declining resource base. That's the kind of thing we need to avoid. And if we don't do that consciously, deliberately, in a planned and rational manner, nature will do it for us. It's very simple. Happens to every other species that goes into overshoot. Nature slams it back because populations operate according to two things, or two sets of things. There's so-called positive feedback. If you have 10 children and they have 10 children and they have 10 children, in a few generations, the place is overpopulated because each additional group of people adds to the base that is producing more people. That's positive feedback. So positive feedback is anything that accelerates a deviation. Okay? So the addition of a few hundred people increases the population, but if they have more children, that accelerates that increase in population. Negative feedback is anything that suppresses a deviation. So supposing we see a vast expansion, just for the sake of argument, of rabbits, but that's good food for foxes, so the fox population grows and there's an amazing increase in the rate of predation on rabbits, then that's a negative feedback on the rabbit population. Well, that's how nature works. Something gets out of control, it gets slammed back because there are feedbacks in the system. So there's an uneasy balance always between positive and negative feedback. The balance of nature is not some constancy. It's a continuous flux between positive and negative forces that come into some kind of alignment. So we've talked about productivity and carbon cycles. Plants produce, because carbon is going into the atmosphere normally from a certain amount of natural forest fires, the respiration of animals. So the carbon is made available to plants. They take it up, convert it back into biomass, which the animals consume and convert to themselves, but they burn it off and put it back into the plant system and so on. Well, that all goes out of whack when you start burning fossil fuels, increasing the human population to the extent that it is, and so on and so forth. So at some point, because humans have gone so far out of the normal dimensions of population dynamics, we will be slammed back. I personally have much doubt about that. But a lot of people say you're both full of shit and it's not going to happen. But
I'm wondering about this. I'm not an economist, but everything that you're saying seems not only reasonable, but it just extremely plausible. It's hard to find any way in which what you're saying isn't true. And it strikes me that your career has run through the arc of the intensification of neoliberalism. Like your career runs through Reagan, through Clinton, through the recession. Where does this delusion come from? I mean, maybe I'm stating that too harshly, but like in observing your colleagues, like why isn't it met with, oh yeah, that's actually a really important thing to take into account?
Again, these are the fundamental philosophical questions of our age. And these are huge questions. Look, again, I have to go back to make the point. Humans don't live out of reality. We make stuff up. So we start way back in the 19th century, where economists are trying to come up with an idea around what the economy is that replicates the successes of Newtonian physics. And so on. And that was fine, and it works to a degree, let's face it. There's no question that the economy has been highly productive, and humans are extremely creative, and technology has done wondrous things. But we have other things going on at the same time. So in the post-war period, it was a period of enormous growth, but also very equal distribution of income. People were doing well in North America. We could start to think about other things. And so we started to think seriously about women's liberation, about, the growth of the economy is great, but the air is polluted and the ocean and the rivers are catching fire and we've got, this, that. So environmental regulation started coming on stream big time. Oddly, people like President Nixon in the US were real powerhouses in getting things through. The Environmental Protection Act, 1970, something like that. So there was a whole change in the social climate around that time that was beginning to recognize there were certain things going wrong. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring came out in 60 something or other, I think, can't remember exactly.
Yeah, 62, I think.
But pointing out again that, okay, we produce this enormous agricultural output, but it's killing off other wildlife, and this is going to feed back on human beings because those are poison. Humans are the only species that poisons its own food supply to eliminate competition. Remember where I said the competitive displacement of non-human beings? It's part of our way of thinking. No other animal can live that competes with us. That's a way of thinking. But Rachel Carson pointed out the downside and the negative feedback that comes out of that kind of thinking. So there was a lot of stuff going on at the time that some people today would call communist pinko crap, right? And so one of the things that happened, I'm not saying it's the thing that kicked this off, but it's certainly a key thing. You can look it up online. It's something called the Powell Memorandum. Lewis Powell was uh, a lawyer who was very much on the corporate side of things here, a corporate way of thinking. And he saw the emergence of civil liberties and female liberation and gay rights and the environmental protections that were coming out as a real threat to the fundamental values that had made America great, to use a current. Okay, but the point of the matter is, he wrote a very important memo. You can look this up. There's a very good history of this called the Lewis Powell Memorandum to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And not only is that memorandum downloadable, but there's all kinds of analysis of it. And what Powell did was say, look, to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and its multitude of corporate membership, we're in trouble. All of these social movements threaten the fundamental corporate values that have enabled you to grow to such powerful entities. And if you don't get a grip on this social change, then there's going to be an enormous setback in the way America progresses. So he advised the corporate sector to start defending itself against the emergence of these countervailing values. Start funding economics departments. Get them to hire neoliberal thinkers, people who really know about your values. Start, and where you can't do that, set up independent think tanks to counter these nonsensical ideas about climate change and how science constrains us and so on and so forth. I have a friend at the University of Pittsburgh a few years ago who started looking at the rate at which right-wing think tanks began to emerge after the publication of the Powell Memorandum. There were a mere handful of them in the 1970s. There's several hundred today. And again, this involves an enormous amount of money put out there with the explicit intention. Remember, I talked about the social construction of reality. The idea here was to reconstruct reality around corporate values. So back when I was a kid, we talked about human rights and the public good and individual responsibility to community and so on and so forth. Well, those are all hostile ideas to liberalism, individual rights, corporate values, growth, and all of that kind of stuff. So the whole political discourse has changed. Concepts of community, cooperation have been downgraded and replaced with individualism and competitive relationships. And even the idea of selfishness, for a while, it was a badge of honor to consider oneself to be selfish because of this mythic construct that if everybody were selfish, then we'd all benefit. Right? That's the kind of idea of the hidden hand in the economy. If each person pursues his own individual well-being to the max, then we all benefit. By the way, that wasn't the only thing that individual wrote, but it's the one that caught on because it fed into this neoliberal notion of the economy as a separate entity and can grow forever. And environmentalists, get out of the way. Feminists, get out of the way. Civil rights, it's an impediment to growth, and so on and so forth. So we saw a deliberate reconstruction of the way people think about themselves in relation to community, in relation to the environment. We've seen since then a dismantling of much of the progressive legislation around environmental controls. The powers of the Environmental Protection Agency in the states has been diminished. Trump did a lot of this, by the way. So we deliberately socially construct the environments out of which we live. So people think in a particular way, and they think they're being reasonable because this is the way they have been raised. Okay? If you are raised in an environment in which you repeatedly hear these ideas over and over again, that becomes your reality. Now, and keep in mind, what we think of as our reality is a socially constructed model of how humans behave, how the environment behaves, and so on, which may or may not correspond with the nature of real reality, right? So I used to, students never, this is so mind-boggling when you really get into it that we make it up as we go along. I used to say this, okay, let's assume for the sake of argument that you are offered an opportunity to take the first flight on a marvelous new aircraft. In fact, there's two marvelous new aircraft. This one over here was designed by a group of the world's best aeronautical engineers who know all there is about material science and metal stress and aerodynamic flow of, air over planes and so on. So these guys really got it together. And that's just an incredible aircraft. Look at that thing. And over here, we have an aircraft designed by a bunch of economists and artists who don't know shit about airflow or material science or anything else, but it's very comfortable. It's got a big lounge, and everybody gets a bed, and you can drink yourself silly on your first flight. Now, the question I put to you is, which of these two aircraft would you like to go on as the first ride? And clearly, everybody jumps onto the aerodynamically sound aircraft. That's the kind we actually have in the air right now. You wouldn't go for this other one because each aircraft contains in its design a model of the reality in which the aircraft is embedded, but a model derived from the headspace of the people who designed it. So the artists and economists who design aircraft A have a very different view of the nature of reality, which is incorporated into the aircraft, and the designers of the aircraft designed by who are all aeronautical engineers. So our models, we can't not have models. Every thought you have is a model of something, but they may or may not represent reality adequately. So going back to an earlier question, what we want in ecological economics is a model of the economy that matches the biophysical reality within which the economy is embedded. A model of the economy that matches the social environment and the actual behavior of people. Real people have families, they love each other, they have communities, they care for each other. None of that's in economic models. But that's how real people are. So real people live in a real physical world in which they are utterly dependent on the integrity of the ecological systems that have created this environment in which we live. And they live in communities of affectionate, loving people who actually not only compete with each other, sure, competition is real, but so is cooperation. So is the notion of community. So is something called the public good. And yet we're seeing those things abolished and set aside in favor of a different model of reality. So the real thing people have to think about, it seems to me, is where did I get this way of thinking that I have in my head? Where has that come from? And how does my vision of the economy map to the biophysical reality within which the economy operates? And so we have to become conscious. You see, we are not conscious organisms. We have been literally, people say, oh, I'm not going to take part in any kind of propaganda. You are propagandized to the hilt ever since you were born. Our whole education system is dedicated to reproducing the kind of environment that we've got. Okay? All of our universities teach neoliberal economics. You can't find 10 professors of ecological economics in the United States. I was the only one at my university, and no one's replaced me. I've been retired for 12 years. So that's the nature of our current cultural reality and how we view the world. So mostly, right now, we're dedicated on planet Earth to the belief that we can maintain and grow the present system, and we can do this by the constant substitution of our current ways of doing things with new inventions of the human mind. So we see this mythic construct of 100% renewable green energy transforming the planet. People are buying into it. Yay, I don't have to do anything except buy an EV. Well, if you look at a big EV under a full life cycle analysis, just manufacturing the battery on a big Evian produces as much carbon dioxide as driving a regular car for 700,000 kilometers or 17 years of its life or something like that. So a big EV is actually worse than the internal combustion car that it's replacing, because not only does it produce as much carbon dioxide, but it's comprised of a whole collection of rare earths and metals that have to be mined from ever decreasing qualities of ore, producing vastly larger piles of mine tailings that leach into the soils and pollute the waters, and et cetera, et cetera. So the efforts we're making to maintain our present course through technological advances are simply, extending overshoot. They're making us ever greater impositions on the biophysical realities of the planet. We're literally in the course of trying to electrify the Earth, dismantling the Earth. And by the way, when you hear that the Green Revolution is already underway, forget it. I'm not making numbers up. So you can download something called the Statistical Review of World Energy. It's a free book on the environment. It's very well compiled by some of the best energy analysts on Earth. For years, it was done by BP Petroleum. It's now taken over by the Energy Institute. Well, look at it carefully, people. And what you will find is that so-called wind and solar energy, which have really taken off from nothing and grown enormously, provided about 12 or 14% of the world's electricity last year. That's a big number, 12 or 14% of electricity, but it's taken 40 years. 40 years to get to 12 or 14%. But electricity is only 20% of our final energy consumption. So 12% of 20%, it turns out that this enormous revolution in wind and solar energy provides us with about 2.3 or 2.7, I guess, percent of the world's final consumptive energy right now. 2.7%. So the notion that we're going to convert, look, right now, 81 or 82% of the world's primary energy supply is still fossil fuel. You know what it was in 1992? 81%. So it fluctuates. It's dropped maybe 4 or 5% in the last 30, 40 years. But in 92 is what it is today. So essentially, the green energy that we've seen produced has not replaced fossil fuel. It's simply added to the energy supply, which means it's added to the means by which humans can scour out the planet. So not only are we mining out the landscape and destroying the forest, we're now going for the deep sea mining. We're going to go to Mars and so on and so forth. So there's this uncontrollable constructed impulse to keep going and consuming, and in the process, dismantling the very fabric of our existence.
On the deep sea mining tip, I saw recently, and maybe you saw this as well, this was literally yesterday or 2 days ago, that they've discovered that oxygen is emerging from the deep sea where there are no plants and where sunlight doesn't reach. And so they have guesses why, but they still don't exactly know why, because the sort of nodules down there, based on octopus beaks and fish skeletons, whatever, is not enough to reach electrolysis. So they don't really know, but it kind of gets to your point around, there's so much we don't even understand about how these systems work. Absolutely. And we're already going to try to fuck them up to pursue growth.
Yeah, you're right. I've read those reports as well, and I think the depth of our ignorance far exceeds that of our knowledge about those things. I suspect they'll turn out to be real, but unimportant in the large scheme of things. I mean, there was a time 3 billion years ago when there was no oxygen on Earth. If these things were happening under the sea, they weren't obviously producing enough to make a big difference. Oxygen emerged with the emergence of a process called photosynthesis. It's interesting. You see, photosynthesis, when it took off as a way of let's go way back, microbes ran out of chemical energy. But a few of them had managed to tap into the solar flux. And of course, they were the survivors. This is natural selection. And the survivors not dependent on chemical energy, could use solar energy to survive. And so they grew and expanded. But part of that process was the evolution of oxygen. Well, when oxygen started to displace carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there was a massive die-off. Oxygen is toxic to the forms of life that existed prior to the evolution of oxygen. So I think we will continue to see discoveries of the kind you're talking about, some oxygen being produced in the bottom of the sea, but it's trivial in the grand scheme of things when you think of the 4 billion or 5 billion year history of Earth. At least that's my current impression of what this is all about.
Got it.
But you've raised a really important point. One thing that I think a lot of old farts like me realize is that the more we know, the less we know. Everything that we learn asks more questions than we started out with. And so human beings act as if we're all powerful, all knowing, and really have a grip on it. We know bugger all. And if we didn't, we have to be more humble. Humility is a great thing. You don't mess with the atmosphere. You don't mess with the climate system. That's not a good idea. Okay. And yet we've taken upon ourselves to think we can control the forces of nature that have evolved and stabilized over billions of years of Earth's evolution. I think that's a very, very dangerous attitude to take on, the attitude of perfect knowledge. And unfortunately, many who think that, humans have that kind of control are the people we hear most about right now, saying, well, we're going to colonize Mars and the moon and don't worry about a thing. And if you think in long-termism, humans will upload their consciousness to a universal computer and billions of us, trillions of us will populate the universe. Well, so don't worry about what's happening now. That's our future. I'm sorry, I'm a little bamboozled by that kind of thinking. But
you and me both. And I want to talk about that particular subject, but before we get to him and to those sort of follies, I want to rewind for a second because you've written about the human eco predicament, and I want to sort of like state that with a fine point and get into it. And so I guess maybe to start, what is it and how does a predicament differ from a problem?
I don't know if there's a big difference. The human eco predicament is my way of saying, look, we are in a state of overshoot. So let's be clear again, redefine it. Overshoot exists when the rate of consumption by human beings exceeds the rate of reconstruction by nature. We are exceeding the regenerative capacities of the Earth. Overshoot exists when the human production of degraded toxic waste materials exceeds the assimilative capacity of the natural system. And when you're in overshoot, you're depleting what you need and polluting the rest of it. Our predicament is that is the reality in which an economy is operating, which believes that that's not a problem, that we can continue to grow forever. So our operating, if you like, our operating system, the current cultural narrative, this socially constructed belief system, is at such odds with reality that we can't even see the reality. That's the predicament. So how do you solve a problem that you don't even understand? A very famous, Canadian famous friend of mine, a former environmental philosopher, made a wonderful statement. I'll just paraphrase it. You cannot solve a problem that you don't understand. So we haven't a clue in the mainstream about the nature of the problem, and yet we're trying to solve it by means that are exacerbating the problem. Now, again, people find that can't be true. I'll go back to 1992, the year in which the United Nations Framework Agreement on Climate Change came out. Since then, it set up the COP process, these annual meetings of the world powers to resolve climate change. There's been 28 COP meetings since then, a dozen other international meetings on climate issues, all oriented toward reducing carbon emissions. Well, in the course of that period, they've gone up, 60, 70%? So they've been an utter, absolute failure because the model from which they operate has nothing to do with the nature of the biophysical reality, or it doesn't acknowledge the nature of that biophysical reality. So if you look at the output of COP meetings, it's all about massive investment. We need to invest in growth, grow the economy. And how do we do that? We produce massive quantities of solar panels and wind towers and EVs and electrify everything else. There's a huge opportunity. You can look online and you'll see climate change is enormous economic opportunities for growth, to make profit, to create high-paying jobs and all of that kind of stuff. Well, it's all of that kind of stuff that has produced the problem. And the growth of green energy isn't solving the problem. It's adding, at this time, it's adding to it. So again, it simply illustrates the human predicament of operating from a model which is completely at odds with the biophysical nature, or with the nature of our biophysical reality, and being incompetent even to recognize that is the case. Or if we do recognize it, to deny it completely. Which raises a whole other line of thinking here, I think is important to talk about. It's a wonderful little book written a few years ago by Bruce Wexler called Brain and Culture. Now, Wexler shows that humans are kind of interesting in this regard. We talked about the social construction of reality earlier. What Wexler shows is that repeated experiences over and over and over again, repeated ideas over and over again, literally help to shape the microcircuitry of the developing brain. So what do you wind up with if you hear something over and over and over again, or do something over and over? And this is how you learn how to play a musical instrument, for example. You develop synaptic circuits which embed that set of, well, impulses in the brain. And once these patterns are in place, people will seek out other people that think or do the same way. They'll seek out experiences that reinforce this pre-existing circuitry, and they will deny, forget, or ignore any contrary information. Now, think about this. I think of this in biophysical or bioecological terms. It's a marvelous adaptation to primitive conditions. So if you go back to the Paleolithic, say a couple of 100,000 years ago, when the modern human brain is evolving, it's a very simple environment that's basically unchanging. You could be born, and even if you lived 100 years, nothing happened. Same environment. You met maybe a couple of hundred people in the whole course of your lifetime, but mostly you interacted with a few dozen at most. So there weren't many real complex challenges to the human brain. And if you develop this way of acquiring your tribal myths, tribal norms, acceptable patterns of behavior, and adopted them without even thinking about it, that's what education is all about, isn't it? If you acquired this, it gave you a sense of identity, and it created a sense of tribal cohesion, because we all share the same beliefs, values, assumptions, and behaviors. Our social norms are constructed and embedded in our neural circuitry to reinforce our survival as individuals and as a cultural or social unit. And by the way, this is also the origins of what I think of as the in-group, out-group phenomenology, because you have these sets of beliefs, values, and assumptions, and those guys over there have a different set of beliefs, values, and assumptions, and they're our enemies, right? So now we have the clash of religions or political economies or whatever it might be. But the point I'm getting at is that a biological process of acquiring the cultural norms of your tribe, of acquiring, if you like the term we used earlier, the narrative of your particular society. It was highly adaptive to acquire this automatically just by growing up within your tribe 100,000 years ago. We still have that today. We've talked about it. The Powell Memorandum was a way of reconstructing people's reality. We've got a whole educational system dedicated to the proposition that humans are essentially invincible, that the economy can grow forever, that technology will continue to move. So we hear this over and over again in every class taught in every university and every economics and every engineering and every medical science department and so on. That is the way in which we've acquired our own cultural myths. But we also have an exceedingly complex environment. No human brain can wrap itself around the complexity of the internet or the economy or the world trade system or geopolitics. We've created all of these parallel systems, any one of which is really beyond understanding. And yet they all interact in a way to create a meta system of utterly unbelievable, of mind-boggling complexity, far beyond the capacity of any individual person to understand. And there's no means whatever of controlling it. Go out, try to, can the President of the United States control it? No. And it's all changing so rapidly. So whereas if you go back even 700 years, you could look to be 100 years old 700 years ago, and bugger all happened. You wouldn't notice much difference between your village at the time of birth and time of death. Today, everything changes in a lifetime. Almost every technology that's important in my life didn't exist when I was born. There were no jet aircraft, no computers, no cell phones, and so on and so forth. So the pace of change, the pace of cultural evolution has so outpaced biological evolution that I believe, I've actually written a paper about this, that the human brain is obsolete. We have literally created an environment in which we cannot operate with any degree of confidence. We have made ourselves obsolete in that not only the social and political environment, but in the biophysical environment, because it too is cascading and collapsing around ourselves, and we can't come to grips with it. What's the manifestation of our simplistic brains? Climate change. Nobody thinks of overshoot. We think of one simple problem at a time. It's climate change, or it's the pandemic. That's the big issue of the day, or it's the war in wherever the war happens to be. There's several going on right now. So we jump from one of these things, and we never put it together to recognize that climate change and the war in Ukraine and the collapse of, clash between the Jews and the Palestinians is a land fight. It's a resource fight. It's overshoot, folks. It's all about the same issue. But we think of it in these little nitpicking, niggling, single issues at a time, never connecting the dots. The human brain, well, a few people can connect some of the dots, but most people don't. And what you're seeing, one result of this is a fragmentation of people's realities. Now, you see, the emergence of so-called, the popular media enables people with singular, simplistic visions of reality to talk to other people who have the same stupid vision of reality. And they're doing that over here, and we're doing it over here, and somebody else is doing it. It's becoming a global Tower of Babel in which there's no understanding of anything that's important. And yet we all carry on as if we've got the situation under control. Again, it's this complete disconnect between our mental models of ourselves and what we are doing, any of us, and the nature of the biophysical reality we have created. So again, what I'm really trying to say here is that I think we've rendered ourselves obsolete in the environment we have created. Our biological capacities have been exceeded by the complexity of the environment that we've created. Our technology, our cultural evolution has gotten vastly out of control, and we just don't have a clue how to keep up with it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So I want to open up to, possible interventions to this predicament. There's one major one you identify, and you write that advocates of this particular intervention are often vilified as being neo-Malthusian, anti-human, eco-fascist, or racist. What is that intervention?
Well, look here. For one thing, we've got to start talking about the sheer scale of the human enterprise. That's just the size. We've gotten too big for the planet. And there's two parts of that. I mean, consumption, everybody blames consumption, but humans consume. So you've got to look at consumption, yes. You've got to look at waste production, yes. But who's doing all of that? It's population. The human population is too damn big for the planet. So now people say, okay, it can't be true. Well, listen, are we in overshoot or aren't we? I can usually convince most people that climate change, ocean acidity, and all of these so-called ecological problems are indicators, they're co-symptoms of the macro problem called overshoot, and that focusing on any one of them isn't going to solve the big problem. So far, our focus on climate change has worsened overshoot, and it hasn't fixed the climate. How stupid is that? I mean, really, that is stupid. And yet we're not awake to the fact that it's that stupid, that it's not solving the problem, and it's worsening the real problem, which we don't even see. We've misdefined the problem. So we've got to recognize that in this mess, there are two elements, a growing population, and everybody's a consumer. And if we use ecological footprint analysis, we can actually show that the larger driver right now is the growth of population. Even in the first world, my own country, Canada, we have a stupid population policy. We grew by 2 million people last year. But a Canadian has a footprint 20 times larger than a poor person in the third world or the developing world. So by growing European countries or North America, US has a pretty stiff growth rate too. We're adding enormously to our eco footprint because we're relatively rich, high-end consumers. So here, the largest contribution to the growing eco footprint among rich countries is coming from the growth in population, not the rise in consumption by ordinary people. At some point, you've consumed all you really can. Consumption increases and then levels out. There's a asymptotic function going on here because you can't have 47 cars. Well, some people do, but most of us don't. You get one and you stop. So once your certain needs have been satisfied, material consumption levels off, but population growth doesn't. If you go to the very poorest countries, we see exactly the same thing. There's no growth of the economy, or at least any economic growth that occurs is overwhelmed by population growth. And so there again, the main increase in the total consumption by that nation is contributed by the growing population, not the increase in average per capita eco footprint. So if you look at the national footprint, what's growing is the national footprint because of population growth, not because anybody's getting better off. So it doesn't matter which end of the spectrum you look at, population growth is driving to a greater extent than income growth, the increase in eco footprints. Okay, so that's it. If you're going to come to grips with this problem, you have to deal with the population issue. That's from my ecological perspective. Every species has the capacity for exponential growth, but every species will be slammed back by negative feedback. This again is that balance between positive and negative feedback if it gets too far out of hand. But look where the mainstream comes at this. You see, they're not thinking in those terms at all. They have a different operating model. Their operating model is growth, growth, and then more growth. And to do that, you need more people. And by the way, to keep the economy pumping out lots of goods, you need more workers. So let's grow a little bit more to get more workers. And oh, by the way, our pension plans depend on deposits from a working population to sustain the growing number of old guys like me. So you got to have more people, more people, more people. And because of that attitude, most people in the mainstream today, the corporate world and in governments, see population decline as the big problem, right? So we see the rise in pronatalist policies. It's happening in the United States. Abolish abortion, get rid of immigrants, encourage women to have more babies, get big families, and we admire people with 5 or 6 kids and so on and so forth. So you have this, in my view, from my perspective, you have to understand everybody looks at this from their own perspective. From the perspective of population ecology, the mainstream is setting us on a course that is destined to result in population collapse. Because we cannot, on a finite planet, support on a decent material standard or 8, 10 billion people. We are not now, and this is a real kicker for most people, we are not now supporting 8 billion people. The earth is being degraded supporting the average material standard living, which is excessive of what the earth can support. And we expect to add another 2 billion people by the 2050 or thereabouts, the end of the century, somewhere in that range. Well, again, I don't think that's going to happen because there will be intervening negative feedbacks, but it's a stupid plan in the first instance. So we should be making available, by the way, my province here in Canada, in British Columbia, free birth control. Everybody can just go into their pharmacist and get what they need. That should be universal on the planet. People should have better education about population health, free access to whatever birth control methods are available. We need more independence on the part of women. Women need to become economically independent of males and families so that they can, in effect, take better control over their own bodies. But we're seeing in many countries a reversal of all of that. A denial of access to abortion, incentives to have larger families in form of baby bonuses and so on and so forth. So again, there's these two different worldviews, both social constructs. I have to emphasize, what we're talking about here is my social construct, at least the way I've been trained to think. The question people listening have to ask is whether this vision is more realistic in the context of the nature of biophysical reality than a vision that says there are no limits to anything and we can just keep going forever. That's the question. And if you begin to think in those terms, you're into the domain of what I call critical thinking. Question everything. Today, nobody questions anything. We just take it. If the internet says it's true, it must be true. If the government says it's true, if you know what I'm getting at.
Well, also sometimes people question, from my perspective, the wrong, like there's a general skepticism of, for instance, expertise. Question the experts, but take unquestioningly something that sounds salacious or like the plot of a movie.
There's lots of crappy experts out there. So to some extent, that's true. Question me. Okay? I'll have an argument with anybody. No, quite seriously. I'm not. I don't pretend that I am all-knowing. I just say this is the way I think, and here's how the way I think. How do you think? Tell me how you think, and let's compare and contrast that with the way the world works. But that's critically thinking, you see. I learn every day. I'm not trying to pretend for a moment I know everything at all. I'm going to learn a little bit from this conversation about how better to get these ideas across. But my point is, most people, when they say question the experts, that's fair enough, but it's been translated into a general distrust of science. So you see, part of this thing is sort of talking about the Palomendranum and then the emergence of right-wing think tanks has been a deliberate attempt to deconstruct confidence in scientific information. To deconstruct climate change, that's mythic. No, that's bullshit. The climate is always changing. So that's a way in which you distrust the expert climate scientists who can tell you, yeah, climate's changing. Yeah, it's always changed, but it's never changed this much, this fast, ever. And we're on the verge of, wrecking the life support system of the planet. So you can hear any number of half-truths. The climate's always changing. Well, yes, but that's irrelevant to the real argument around climate change.
Well, it speaks to, I heard Peter Brannon the other day say that we're heating the planet 10 times faster than the planet heated during the end Permian extinction event, which wiped out 85% of life on Earth. And it reminds me of the chart in one of your papers that's just looking at population, where it's kind of linear for a few hundred years and then just a vertical line starting in
linear for 200,000 years virtually. It's flat. Look, there's been two bumps in human agriculture 10,000 years ago. The population growth rate increased from 0 to maybe like a fraction of 1%. And then in 1810, say, we hit 1 billion And since then, it's been exponential growth. So that's totally abnormal. And it's because, remember I talked about negative and positive feedback? Every population has this potential for positive feedback growth, exponential growth. But every population is suppressed by the negative feedback of scarcity, disease, conflict, and so on and so forth. Well, what human ingenuity did back in the 18th or 19th century was remove much of the negative feedback, particularly with the use of energy. Energy and science gave us the capacity to increase the productivity of the systems upon which we depend. Combined with that was huge advances in so-called population health. So we had sewerage systems and other ways of limiting the negative feedback caused by disease. Cities were bloody awful death traps, because of concentrations of people, and once diphtheria or some other disease got in there, whole villages were wiped out by the plague during the so-called Middle and Dark Ages. So science removed that. But what you're doing is removing the negative feedback that was keeping population in control. So what happened? Boom, population exploded. And within 200 years, we added more people by a factor of 8 than had been added in the previous 300,000 years of human history. Unprecedented event. And yet, in our mindset, since the last 7 or 8 generations, or maybe 10 generations of people have lived through that, that's normal. We take that to be the norm, but it's not. It's the single most abnormal period in history. And what animal studies show us is that, yes, you can have these explosions when times are good. If the classic study, you put reindeer on uninhabited islands with no predators but lots of food, population explodes for several generations. Then, boom, it collapses because they run out of food, disease spreads, and so on. It's going to happen to us. We have got an anomalous period of enormous population growth, but negative feedback is starting to kick in the form of climate change, in the form of impacts on crop production, in the form of the drying up of many aquifers. The U.S. is going to have a big problem when the Oklahoma aquifer dries up. You're already seeing competition among states for the remaining water supplies.
I live in California.
Okay, you know what we're talking about. In my country, we're seeing the same things, and now it's compounded. Well, California too, by wildfires. I think I mentioned that last week I was almost trapped in the interior by a major fire that was blocking one of the highways. We've got, I think, 400 wildfires now in British Columbia. 20,000 people were evacuated from Jasper National Park over the weekend because of a wildfire threatening not only the residents, but the entire tourism population in the thousands. So we're scrambling to find place. This is negative feedback. This is nature telling, say, you've gone too far, folks, and I'm going to get you.
So part of what you're advocating for with population control is what you call a soft landing. That basically, like, the negative feedbacks are going to get us, or we're going to find a way to ramp down. Can you describe that?
Yeah, well, I got into it a little bit by making birth control and education around family health available to everyone, um, economic freedom of women. But what I believe is we can soften the blow, but there will be a lot of suffering and pain in coming years. Earth might be, look, absent fossil fuels. Now, let's think about fossil fuels for a moment. That enormous explosion of people is a fossil fuel phenomenon. Okay, our use of fossil fuel increased something like 1,000-fold as the population grew by a factor of 8 and the economy by a factor of 100. But it's all fossil fuel propelled. Now, we are in a classic rock and a hard place situation because if we keep using fossil fuels, assuming supplies are available, we're going to suffer the enormous negative consequences of large-scale climate change, which would result in the drying up of the best agricultural areas, massive migrations of people, geopolitical turmoil, and the collapse of civilization. But if people say, stop fossil fuels, you can't stop fossil fuels. Immediately we run out of food, transportation, everything that keeps a big city going is fossil fuel dependent. So what do you do when you suddenly don't have a substitute energy supply? And people say, well, what about solar and wind? Well, as I said, that's 2.7% of the world's final energy consumption last year after 40 years of growth. You think that you're going to manage, given the growth of 2 billion more people, to convert the whole of the world to electric systems in the next 20 years without destroying the biophysical basis of this planet, given the mining, refining, transportation, and so on and so on? It can't happen. So we're in a very tricky space. We can't continue using fossil fuels safely. We can't abandon them safely. So we need to somehow, if you and I and several of our friends could control the situation, we could design a way of softening the blow, sharing the remaining productivity of the planet, so that as we get back to 2 billion people by the middle of the next century, a minimum amount of suffering has occurred. That's all we can do.
And why 2 billion?
Well, again, if you think of a non-fossil fuel, okay, I'm going to assume that we don't find a substitute for fossil fuel. I don't think there is one. Electricity ain't it. So we can't continue current levels of production. So there ain't going to be the massive supplies of food. There's not going to be production of anything on the same scale that we've enjoyed during this short-term fossil fuel era. So things will shrink. It's as simple as that. Things will shrink. So it depends on how do we want them to shrink. 2 billion, some people think that's too much. I have one friend who thinks 50 million people might be the long-term carrying capacity of the Earth. I think 2 billion is on the edge. So let's look at it this way. Right now, on Earth, these are real numbers, there's about 13 billion hectares of ecologically productive land and water base. That's about 1.5 hectares per capita. So how many people are willing to think of themselves as living on the productive and assimilative capacities of 1.5 hectares? That's about 4 or 5 acres. Okay, that's it. That's all you got. They're not making it anymore. So I think when we say 2 billion people, we're actually pushing the limits a little bit. Okay, all you've got is a few acres for yourself. And right now, the average level of consumption requires the output of about 2.5 hectares, which is twice what's available, almost twice. So the difference is the overshoot, isn't it?
Right.
So if you want to get back to living on the earth as it is, and as at a rate at which it can continue to regenerate itself, then 2 billion is really pushing the limits. Now, so that's the starting point for analysis. I'm willing to discuss any variation on that theme and
Yeah.
counter arguments, but I think that's a good starting point for analysis.
Well, let's talk the social equity piece, which you've discussed and written about. Obviously, some of the reactions to demands to stop using fossil fuels among the developing world have been, well, you're kneecapping us when you used, an excess proportion of what was available in order to get ahead. And now, because of the Bretton Woods world order and because of colonial sort of dynamics, we can't get ahead any other way. There's a similar dynamic that I think folks who would argue against the population control advocacy would kind of bring to the equation and say, well, we need the population, especially if we're going to have to ramp down fossil fuel use. So how are you thinking about where social equity fits in?
Well, I'm not sure it's going to fit in. You see, I mean, one of the things that these discussions always assume is that we're dealing with solvable problems. And I'm not prepared to accept that. I think there are such things as non-solvable problems. I don't know of a single country that has said or is even seriously talking about scaling back its level of economic activity or its GDP per capita to benefit the rest of the world. You can find one. I'm happy to entertain that possibility, but I don't see any. We'll look next presidential election in several months in the United States be based on arguments to scale down the U.S. enterprise so that more people elsewhere on the earth could live? I don't think so. It sure as hell isn't going to happen here in Canada. We have an election coming up in a year or so too. So no country is willing to entertain that, and yet that's what is absolutely necessary if we're going to resolve this global predicament in a humane way. So, in the best of all possible worlds, the world governments would be getting together right now and saying, look, we really screwed up here. We followed this economic expansionist course for the last couple of hundred years. It's led to this situation of overshoot. Overshoot means, by definition, we have to consume less and produce less pollution. How are we going to do that equitably? So various people propose, well, you do it on a per capita basis. You may have heard of the so-called contraction and convergence solution to the global CO2 crisis. The developed countries, which have created most of the problem by burning most historically of the fossil fuels, must contract their fossil fuel use to create sufficient ecological space, as it were, for poor countries to grow up, and we'll meet somewhere in between. So we in the wealthy Western countries will give up much of our wealth and consumption in order to create the ecological space necessary for needed growth in the third world. Well, as I said, when you are in overshoot, it means that even average levels of consumption are excessive. So not only do we have to shrink to meet a growing external reality, then once we get there, we all have to shrink together. Okay? Back to that 1.6 hectares or 4 or 5 acres per capita. I don't see that happening. There's no discussion of this. This isn't, see, again, that's what one would do coming from the perception of the world, the social construct that I have, and a few others have, that we think maps well to the nature of the biophysical world in which you live. But the mainstream is operating from a different reality up here, which we believe is completely at odds with the nature of the biophysical reality. So the question is, what's going to win out? And right now, it's obvious what's winning out. Everything we're doing globally is oriented to what I call business as usual, but by alternative means. So it's growth, consumption, rising incomes. That's all on everybody. Every government's main platform is dependent on those things, but we'll do it differently. We're going to do it smarter. We're going to use electricity instead of fossil fuels, and so on and so forth. So it's the old human trick of assuming that technology will solve our problems and that we're going to pull this technological rabbit out of the hat and move forward more or less as we have for the last 200 years.
Mm.
And again, the alternative message is the last 200 years is an anomaly. We are going to go back to renewable energy, but it's going to be mechanical wind power and water power and not necessarily. Look, even renewable energy is a lie because it's not. Solar panels last 25, 30 years, then they have to be replaced. And all that construction and mining, it's all done so far by fossil fuels. Wind turbines last typically less than 20 years in actual use, and they're flying apart daily. And by the way, the waste piles of used wind turbines and solar panels around the world is becoming an enormous problem in and of itself. So these technological fixes always bring with them false confidence and additional burden on the planet.
Mm.
Okay, so soft landing is a theoretical possibility, but it requires a massive change in the human dominant mindset. We need to construct, you see, look how clever the right wing was in the 1970s in seizing upon something. The catalyst might have been something like the Powell Memorandum to, in effect, recreate or reconstruct our political discourse around the economy and society. It was a marvelous way to go about it because even if they didn't know it, they were creating new neural circuitry that we're now all living from. Well, we need to do something similar that embeds these alternative ideas so that the next generation recognizes that we have to live in community, we have to cooperate, that if any of us are going to survive, we have to share the available bounty of the planet. And by the way, in the process, we have to reduce our families, reduce our lifestyles, and so on. Look, people say, you're talking about a 50%, actually, it's closer to 80% reduction in our energy use. But that takes us back to the 1920s. 50% is, we had half our incomes in the 50s that we do now. By every measure, people in the 50s and 60s in North America were happier than they are today, with twice as much income. So we have to recognize that even the notion that rising incomes are going to make us happier and happier is a social construct.
Mm. I mean, your work does an incredible job living up to the adage that a problem well stated is half solved. Thinking about that other half, thinking about the other half on the strategy standpoint, you referenced some strategies around like what you would imagine would begin to set us on a path toward, sort of limiting our population and starting to ramp our population down. Are there other strategies you're thinking about in terms of, like, thinking about the Powell memorandum as a sort of dark strategy that had,
Mm-hmm.
long tail effects? Are there good long-term strategies like that artists, storytellers, engaged citizens,
Oh,
like
sure.
things that you would advise or that you're thinking about?
There are hundreds of civil organizations out there working on these problems. I suppose the best known one right now is the International Degrowth Movement, which is really European centered in Spain and in France and so on. I've been to a couple of conferences. So again, there the idea is to recognize limits to growth, recognize that the human system right now has exceeded the capacity of the planet, and to literally plan and engineer a soft landing. Now, the problem, I think, with degrowth is that they refuse to look at the population question. And it goes to something you said earlier. See, I've been called every name you can imagine, from neo-Malthusian to neo-fascist, because I say we need to look at the population question. That's still a taboo subject, even for an organization like the Degrowth People, who think we can accommodate everybody happily with the existing productivity system. I just don't think so. So that's a matter of some dispute, and we could talk about that forever. But the point is, there are very active uh, groups around the planet who are concerned about these issues and working actively. And the degrowth movement is the best. It's so important that it's debated regularly in the European community and in the parliaments, that they have committees examining the degrowth question. And so that's, I think, a tremendously encouraging perspective, because it's beginning to create the space in which we can at least talk about these things.
Mm.
So if any of your listeners were to go online and simply look up degrowth, there's hundreds of papers describing what the movement is all about and where it's going and so on and so forth. Transition time is another one. I mean, there's no point in listing them all. There are literally hundreds of organizations. I founded one with some friends here in Vancouver called One Earth Living, which we're attempting to get this dialogue going. We've been working now for 20 years. This is our 20th year. Unsuccessfully, but we've made some progress in at least getting some discussion of these issues moving forward. So I think of these kinds of things as lifeboats. The Titanic is going down, but in hundreds of communities around them, people are building these little conceptual lifeboats. They're learning how to relocalize. The future, in my view, will be a relocalized future. There won't be the capacity for mass movements of goods and services around the planet. So we should be retraining ourselves in the basic skills needed to keep a community going. We don't make our shoes in North America. We can hardly tie our own laces, for Christ's sake, because we offshored everything. It's economically efficient to do that, but it's ecologically stupid in the extreme if you think that 20 or 50 years from now, communities or regions are going to be much more self-reliant and have to learn to live off the product of their local land and waterscapes. So they're are many, many organizations oriented toward relocalizing economic activity, learning the basic skills required to provision a small community using local resources to the extent possible. Those are the kinds of things I think we should be encouraging en masse because they're totally compatible with the degrowth movement, but they're also equipping people to be self-reliant, to have some sense of cooperative relationship with other people in their communities, to recognize that we are all mutually independent. Part of the problem with the Powell Memorandum, and I shouldn't lay it all on Powell, but the whole neoliberal construct is this: we're all just individuals. Remember Margaret Thatcher's famous words? There's no such thing as community. It's just a bunch of individuals bouncing around trying to maximize their own take. Well, that kind of thinking is completely destructive if you're thinking of a downsized, much smaller planet working locally off of a limited resource base. It has to be a much more community oriented, where we're sharing resources, where we are interested in mutual survival, because that's what we're talking about, mutual survival.
Yeah, for many years, I covered the tech industry, and obviously, the tech industry is a major contributor to a lot of the problems that you've identified. And one thing I've been really grappling with recently, not grappling with, but really thinking, like, wanting to sort of ideas that I've wanted to kind of circulate or sort of bounce off people is like, how do we create new ways, like in the same way that we need to create new understandings of what we value from productivity to well-being, how do we create new ways of understanding progress and innovation? Because so much of innovation and like even thinking about the future is wrapped up in technology, and yet a lot of the things you're describing sound incredibly innovative to me, but might not involve any technology whatsoever. Or if they do, they're, sort of cyborg approaches to technology where it's duct taping things together to solve a local problem. How are you thinking about technology, innovation, and progress, sort of in the mix of all of this?
Well, look, I don't pretend to be an expert about those kinds of things. These are what I talk about is something of this sort of thing. What is technology? So if I pick something that is absolutely vital to human survival, it's agriculture. Now, people will say, well, modern agriculture is technological marvel, pesticides, fertilizers, big machinery, and all of that stuff. I say a much superior technology is agroecology. If you're an agroecologist, you have to know a great deal more. Look, modern agriculture is what I call brute force technology. You beat the effing shit out of the environment. You pollute the hell out of it, you grind it up and chew it, and it make it produce the one damn thing that you want. But an agroecologist has to know about soils, has to know about climate change, has to temperature and uh, weather patterns, has to know a great deal more about which seeds are going to work best in that pasture or that field, and whether I can get a different seed over here and so. So it's a far more knowledge-based, technologically sensitive system than is brute force agriculture. So technology isn't what people think it is. We tend to think of technology as all the magical tricks of electronic gear and whatnot. Technology is much more than that. It's a complete understanding of the contextual framework within which you must operate. It's knowing about soil, it's knowing about weather, it's knowing about how different seed types respond, and it's knowing about crossbreeding, it's knowing about all of the things we've abandoned in this mad technological rush forward because we think brute force is a better way to produce, right? But look, in modern agriculture, the focus is entirely on one thing: productivity. How do we maximize the output of milk or grain or whatever it might be? That's not ecologically sound. Ecology never maximizes, it optimizes. And what we want to do is to find a way of growing food that doesn't destroy the biophysical basis of growing food. And it ain't going to come from our so-called technological advances. So I think that way about most things. I mean, education. We're not educating people today. Texas has abolished well, the Republican Party has abolished critical thinking from the curriculum. I mean, in other words, you can't question anything. What your elders tell you is the truth. And our elders today are technological wonderkin from Silicon Valley. And they don't know squat about the nature of the biophysical realities that you and I are talking about today. So we need to reform our entire education system, I think, so that people have a fundamental understanding of the kind of understanding I acquired as a youth working on a farm in southern Ontario. That we are of the earth, and whether you like it or not, you are made out of molecules that the dinosaurs were running around with, 50 million years ago. And if we don't maintain the kind of processes that keep that going, that's technology, not the overcoming of those things, not the abolition of that understanding. So merely coming to grips with our role in the ecosystem and how we are ecological entities and beings is a technologically massive, much massive, more challenging intellectually and in every way than it is to say, oh, screw it, we can overcome that by inventing some machine that gets us to colonize Mars. I mean, that's the clash we're dealing with here. So yes, technology is utterly important and a part of our future. But how do you define that technology? What are you talking about when you talk about technology? And I would say to you that something like agroecology is far more technologically savvy than is modern production agriculture. Produces, by the way, maybe as productive as modern
Mm.
production agriculture, but it's not based on hammering the earth to death to get that productivity. It's nurturing. It's continually concerned with the regenerative capacity of the land base, whereas modern agriculture destroys the regenerative capacity of the land base. Much of our modern agriculture is field hydroponics. We wreck the soil. Nothing would grow there if we didn't water and fertilize it. It's very productive with water and fertilizer. But absent those things, both of which are fossil fuel dependent, and you have a soil system that in 150 years of agriculture in North America and Western North America, we've destroyed the soil base that took 12,000 years of post-glacial interaction between the ecosystem and the climate and the soil, or the so-called parent soil base. That's not technology, that's stupidity.
Yeah. It again gets to your point that we're plundering the future to, feed, house, and promote a quality of life in the present. Those are hard words that people need to hear. And so I appreciate that you're saying them. There are 3 questions I like to ask every guest to close out each episode.
Yeah.
You've addressed many things that could answer these questions, so feel free to repeat yourself or extend something that you've already said. But the first one is, what is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
I wish people paid much more attention to the educational system that has produced the mindset that, has produced the world in which we live. If they did so, they would understand that the concept of overshoot, basic ecological reality, is totally missing from our educational curriculum. You can take a course in ecology, but economists are ecologists. They just don't know it. See what I'm getting at? We need to have a fundamental reset of our way of thinking about the nature of our reality in the kind of world that we actually live in. So let's look to the education system. Let's understand the notion of overshoot. Let's realize that humans think in simplistic, reductionist, simple-minded ideas about extremely complex problems. And as such, we're missing the boat completely. That's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's
I
what I come
disagree.
up with.
I think that's an
All
incredible
right.
answer. Both my parents are educators in a general sense, but my mom is a teacher in a public high school, so I am fully with you.
Oh,
Um,
you're lucky.
what is one resource that you use or recommend for making better sense of reality?
Okay, now we have a problem because what is reality? We
I
spent a
knew
great
this was going to come up with you.
Okay, yeah. Well, it's a really important question because if you have this version of reality, you have a different set of sources than if you have that version of reality. And frankly, yeah, right now, I don't trust any source, even in the academic area. It used to be that, 30, 40 years ago, that you could pick this journal or that journal or that journal with a degree of confidence that the papers you were reading had been well researched, well written, and peer reviewed and all. Now that's all disappeared. We're seeing even some of the best journals having to retract papers. We're seeing the profit-making system enter into this stuff. So I get 20 invitations a day, I kid you not, to contribute to this or that phony journal. I mean, but this has become a huge problem among academics. And young academics jump on this because it gives them an opportunity. All I have to pay is $1,000. We guarantee publication, blah, 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 blah. So we're seeing the corruption of the fundamental knowledge creation system that was actually working 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. I think that's a huge problem. The popular media are my wife gets so upset with me because I watch the news at night from several sources and I just tear my hair out because that's bullshit. This is nonsense. Where's the investigative reporting? Nothing they're saying makes any goddamn sense if you really put it in the framework from which I come. The Guardian, I suppose, is more reliable than most sources in terms of mainstream media. So I don't think there's any really reliable source any longer that I can rely on. It gets to an earlier point. Teach yourself the essence of critical thinking. Learning to question the premises. What's your evidence? How many people ask oh yeah, I know you believe. What's your evidence? What's the evidence? You know, I watched the Trump Biden debate. Trump made what 30 bullshit statements. If Biden had been on his toes, he could. What's your evidence for that? What? Here's the counter. Almost everything is defeatable if you have the knowledge base in which to operate here. But we don't see that going on. We don't. People aren't taught how to think critically about any of the sources of information from which we rely right now. So we're seeing, I think, a continued deconstruction of the reliable sources of information out there. And social media have a huge role to play in this because they enable people to talk in these simplistic little echo chambers and share bullshit stories among themselves and become ever more convinced because they're creating those little synaptic circuits that convince themselves that this is truth, but it's absolute nonsense. So we've got a big problem in that. Well, look at what in 2015, I think the English language dictionaries, the Oxford English language dictionary, defined the era in which we live as the post-truth era, because truth becomes whatever you say it is. It's this postmodernist idea that there's no objective reality. Your reality is no better than my reality. Well, to that I say, bullshit. Sorry, this reality is vastly better than your reality. And time will tell that that's the case. Again, it goes back to did I talk about an airplane model to you?
You did, but feel free to bring it up again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, look here. Are you going to get on an airplane designed by people who know something about physics and airflow? Or are you going to get designed on one by a bunch of fanciful artists? Nothing wrong with fanciful art, but they're not good airplane designers. So don't give me a vision of reality based on a completely, hostile set of premises. Question, question, question. What are your premises? What are your beliefs? What are your values? What are your assumptions? How do you arrive at that conclusion? And then perhaps after going through all of that, you can stand with some confidence on a particular point of view, knowing that it's not going to be overthrown by some idiot who's just talking about the latest,
Yeah.
blab on X or whatever it's called now.
Yeah. We didn't talk about space colonization, but that we'll have a chat on space colonization in the future. I don't.
Very short.
You've been very generous with your time. The final question is: what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
Oh God, there was no one moment. It's been a gradual erosion of confidence in our system that started almost as soon as I became a serious academic. Back in the day, again, you see, I was trained as a scientist, and scientists are there to produce truth, facts. And I was also politically engaged. I was one of the members who founded the first international teaching on population, by the way, at the University of Toronto, way back in the 60s, I guess. And one of our professors took us aside afterwards and said, well, that's all very well, but if you're going to be a good scientist, you stay out of politics. Because science is all about facts. Politics is all about values. And right away, I became a bit nervous that, gosh, if science has anything to say, it surely must engage in some fruitful way with the political process. I mean, that was the basis of my going way back to my farm days. So I was, first of all, disillusioned by the notion that science should stay out of politics. It's nothing to do with politics. That was a first step. A second one occurred, I worked back I left out something here. Scientists are trained to think that they have truth and that if we hear this all the time, we need more research, we need better information. More research automatically leads to better decisions. That's the mantra of most science even today. If we produce better information, better data, we can arrive at better decisions. But that's not how the political process works at all. Nevertheless, I graduated and that was my mantra. I thought, okay, I'm going to produce better data. And I got involved in environmental assessment back in the day. Now, to make a long story short, the disillusionment occurred when I became involved in actual decision processes involving environmental assessment. And I saw that the scientific input and the input of communities that were being impacted by major projects far in the Canadian North had almost no effect on the decision-making process. It was a complete disjunction between the two. So what is the point, again, of making better information if it has no impact on the way the decisions are made, which goes back to that first point I made, stay out of politics, etc. So that's very confabulating. Just absolutely blew my brains that we doing all of this work, putting so much money into making environmental assessments, and then essentially ignoring the information. This comes up over and over again. Another one was the notion that caught fire a few decades ago called the three-legged stool. All development had to be about environment, economy, and society. And that's the three-legged stool upon which we stood. But the more I looked at the papers being produced in this area, the more I saw that it was always a trade-off, right? If you started, first of all, society almost never got considered. It was the environment and development. And we always had to compromise, you see. So the way we take into consideration in our three-legged school model is to take these things into account and then dismiss the environment and society and to get along with the development. And here's a very simple thing. If you start with an area that's undeveloped and somebody has a development proposal, but it's a very valuable ecological zone or whatever, yeah, we can compromise. We'll let in a little bit of development. But then 10 years from now, somebody wants another development. Okay, well, we'll compromise. We'll negotiate and, well, then a little bit more development. With each step forward like that, there's less environment and more development. Because every compromise is not, we're not saying, okay, well, let's rip out all these dams and move those towns out of the way and restore this place to its natural habitat. That would be development. That's not the kind of development that goes forward. So I became completely disillusioned, again, by the decision processes, which were so heavily weighed in favor of the status quo, this further growth and development always outweighs the environment, that it was an extension of my way of what I saw in the ecological impact assessment or environmental assessment area. So bit by bit, my confidence in society's capacity to use useful information in its decision process became eroded. Another big one, look, Herman Daly, you may not recognize the name, but he was, okay, well, Herman Daly is one of the fathers of so-called ecological economics. When I discovered Herman Daly, I was mind blown because he's an economist, and yet he knew more about human ecology than 90% of the ecologists with which I was working at the time. And developed a whole new economics, or at least a way of looking at the economic process, which was completely at odds with the way most of us think and do. enlightening and disillusioning at the same time, because I could see how utterly impotent Daly really was in the context in which we operate today. In 1992, I think it was, Daly and I had lunch together in Stockholm. He had just left the World Bank um, over this issue, the conflict between development in the bank and the neoliberal approach the World Bank took in his view of ecological economics. His main argument was they refused to take the environment as an integral part of the decision process. They refused to see that the economy that they were developing globally was a subsystem of the environment. He left. During this lunch, my first real close contact with Herman, who became a good friend over the years, I said, look, you must be inundated with invitations from American universities to hire you on in their economics department. He laughed. I'm an ecologist, he's an economist. He says, Bill, no major university has even sent me a postcard. No major economics journal has ever reviewed any of my work. No, and just went on and on and on. In the end, he did work for the University of Maryland, but it was because some private individual put up the money to sustain his intellectual enterprise, because the department wouldn't do it for him. So Herman Daly, to this day, is one of my great heroes, one of the clearest thinkers I've ever met, an amazingly compassionate individual, unfortunately passed away a couple of years back. But again, his introduction for me to the world of economics in which he lived. He was my economic hero and despised by his profession, and still is to this day. Now, I could go on for the next hour and add to these bits of disillusionment. So my career has really been one disillusion after another in seeing the world ignore those people with whom it should have embraced, of denigrating ideas that might have saved the civilization that we're grappling with right now, and on and on. I won't bother you anymore, but it's been a gradual process of several events, realizing that this is a very tough game I'm involved in here. It's a conflict of inordinate proportions, and the odds are stacked against those who think outside of the mainstream. People like neo-fascists and neo-Malthusians like me. Nobody has any time for us. And Daly, I mean, just an amazing man.
Well, I'm sorry that you've experienced that, and I'm sorry for us that more people haven't listened. Though, of course, there's a growing community of people who are deeply invested in extending your work.
Let me end on an optimistic note. Those are the disillusionments. I'm incredibly encouraged in recent years by the vast number of new lifeboats being spun out, little groups and communities everywhere, starting with big organizations like degrowth to much smaller things on a community basis, where individuals often have just coalesced a small group around them who have tried to grapple with this and who are bringing together people and ways of thinking that are challenging the mainstream in significant ways. So far, I mean, the Titanic, it hit the iceberg, even though there was several miles of warning that we're about to hit that iceberg. The rudder was ill-designed, couldn't steer the ship away. We're probably going to hit the iceberg, but there's going to be a lot more people in lifeboats that have thought these things through and have developed the skills and knowledge necessary to ensure that human beings will survive, the Earth will recover, and in 10 million years, it might be a magnificent place once again to explore and discover.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.